Welcome to On What Slender Threads. This is Tradition 6. My name is Lynn. This presentation is based on a book that I wrote, On What Slender Threads, AA's 12 Traditions from a Historical Perspective. However, it's not necessary to buy the book unless you'd like to have it as a resource. It is my hope that these video presentations will highlight what I learned from studying research historians' work, from the literature available at the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous, and from the experiences and insights of AA friends around the world. I am not a spokesperson for AA. Any inferences in this study are strictly my own and in no way reflect the opinion of Alcoholics Anonymous. I hope it will be helpful. We had explored traditions 1 through 5, that is, how AA groups relate to each other, with 1 being our tradition of unity and common welfare, which we now know rests on the structure of our society. 2, decision-making is informed and spiritual and always made by the group and not by individuals. And 3, the only requirement for membership is a self-declared desire to stop drinking. And without harm to other groups, the group may try for sobriety in any way they like. And as a spiritual entity, the group's primary purpose is to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Now we'll be studying how AA relates to the world outside. So the preamble that seems to fit this particular tradition: proof that alcoholics could recover had been made, but it was by no means sure that such great numbers of erratic people could live and work together with harmony and good effect. Everywhere there arose threatening questions of membership, money, personal relations, public relations, management of groups, clubs, and scores of other perplexities. It was out of this vast welter of explosive experience that AA's 12 traditions took form. Tradition 6 says an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. You will see that this is a significantly reduced version of the original 6-point to assure our future. The shorter form is fine for the individual AA group, but remember, Bill was trying to sell the idea of a conference of AA delegates from all of the groups. Hence, he had much more to say about how the conference should hew to protecting AA's name. The original point says that problems of money, property, and authority may easily divert us from our primary spiritual aim. We think, therefore, that any considerable property of genuine use to AA should be separately incorporated and managed, thus dividing the material from the spiritual. An AA group as such should never go into business. Well, how often can problems such as these plague individual groups? Maybe sometimes, which is why it is important to read the original points. However, it is certain that a conference of groups would have to be mindful of these issues. By the time Bill wrote this point, he and the Foundation grappled with incorporation in state laws. After all, Works Publishing was incorporated in 1940, and the Alcoholic Foundation was incorporated in 1943. This was, in effect, actions intended to separate the material from the spiritual. But like I said, there is more. Bill wanted to make sure the society understood what he meant by related facilities. The original point continues. Secondary aids to AA, such as clubs or hospitals which require much property or administration, ought to be incorporated and so set apart that if necessary they can be freely discarded by the groups. Hence, such facilities ought not to use the AA name. Their management should be the sole responsibility of people who financially support them. Now, Bill is slipping in a personal opinion, I think, in this next sentence when he says, For clubs, AA managers are usually preferred. Then he goes on, but hospitals as well as other places of recuperation ought to be well outside AA and medically supervised. While an AA group may cooperate with anyone, such cooperation ought never go so far as affiliation or endorsement, actual or implied. An AA group can bind itself to no one. Well, good grief, that sounds pretty personal, doesn't it? Well, let's take a look at some of the highlights from his essay on this tradition. He said that the moment we saw we had an answer for alcoholism, it was reasonable, or so it seemed at the time, for us to feel that we might have the answer to a lot of other things. Hospitals didn't like alcoholics, so we thought we'd build a hospital chain of our own. And well, as long as we're doing that, we'd educate the public and we'd gather up derelicts from skid rows and put them in a kind of quarantine confinement. And maybe these places would make large sums of money. And then they really start getting carried away. We're going to rewrite the laws of the land and go into the dark regions of dope addiction and criminality. And the deeper the neurosis, the better we like it. We are an overeager group of people. We can cause laborers and capitalists to love each other and clean up politics. With one arm around the shoulder of religion and the other around the shoulder of medicine, we'd resolve their differences. Our Society of Alcoholics Anonymous might prove to be the spearhead of a new spiritual advance. But as Bill says, we soon found out that we were little more than bankrupt idealists. We are all perfectionists who, failing perfection, have gone to the other extreme and settled for the bottle and a blackout. We can't do AA hospitals because you can't put an AA group into business. The fling at education only left people confused, and we married to all kinds of enterprises. Some were good, some were not so good. Even in AA, he says, we found it imperative to remove the AA name from clubs and 12-step houses. And they came around to the deep-rooted conviction that in no circumstance could we endorse any related enterprise, no matter how good. Then he tells a little story about professionalism in AA. He said some of the great distilling companies proposed to go into the field of alcohol education, that liquor should be enjoyed, of course, not misused. So they wanted to find a good public relations man in Alcoholics Anonymous. Wouldn't that be ideal? And here's a wonderful phrase for all of us to think about. At first glance, it did look like a good thing. That's when an alert should go off with the group to pause and really talk this through. And through talking it through, Bill is showing, then doubt crept in. They started looking at the cons. Our member's full name in all advertising will be used. He'll be described as both the director of publicity and a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And not only was the AA member to break his anonymity at the public level, he was to link the name Alcoholics Anonymous to this particular educational project, sponsored by that distillery company, by the way. So then I love how Bill couches this in terms of each individual's AA responsibility. After discussing this, the group didn't say, no, you can't do this. They asked the AA member, how do you feel about it? And as a result of the discussion, he says, great guns, of course I can't take the job. And we said, nevertheless, you still have a legal right to take this job. And his response is, there's no time for legalities. Alcoholics Anonymous saved my life, and it comes first. I certainly won't be the guy to land AA in big-time trouble, and this would really do it. So Bill then says, we saw as never before that we could not lend the AA name to any cause other than our own. Well, I got sober in a club, and As time went by, there were so many things going on at that club. I was confused about its relationship to AA, and I'm pretty sure the board members of the club were a little confused too. So while I may be somewhat glib by calling this chapter, "This near beer is AA approved." Really? Nope. As superficial as the title is, the implications of this tradition are multifaceted and can be complex, which is why the original, longer point is so important. So what diverts a group from their primary purpose? Notice Bill made a particular point to apply non-affiliation not only to outside enterprises, that part's kind of easy to see for all of us, but also to related facilities, which is trickier for well-meaning alcoholics. I mean, it's related to what we do. Why can't we affiliate? Based on his own experience, particularly during the early days, enthusiastic AAs with all good intentions wanted to help by creating or promoting other alcohol recovery related enterprises. But even today, there are some outside enterprises that loom large in the public's perception of AA. So before we explore AA's related facility difficulties, we will examine outside enterprises, one of which continues to be problematic: religion in AA. The toughest nut to crack for AA was religious affiliation. Remember, Jim Burwell and Hank Parkhurst doggedly tried to get Bill to moderate his references to God, but Bill wrote as if he wanted to have it both ways: non-affiliation with religion and spiritual affiliation with Christianity. So AA's affiliation with religion is tied to its literature and to its early history. Careful as Bill was to avoid any association with the Oxford group in the first edition, disconnecting the Oxford group from AA's origins proved more difficult given its undeniable role in AA history. Now, Bill had concerns about the Oxford group, and among his many concerns was that a connection with the Oxford group would deter alcoholics associated with other religions, particularly Catholic alcoholics, from getting involved with the new fellowship. I mean, Bill had already separated from the Oxford group in New York long before the big book came out. In Akron, AA members, however, were the Oxford group, or at least many thought that they were until the book came out in 1939. Then the book and the fellowship was named Alcoholics Anonymous. The older people in Cleveland and Akron realized that AA wasn't any longer an Oxford group, but Bill noted that we carried the label as long as the meetings were on at T. Henry Williams's house. It's too bad he didn't connect labeling AA to his own religious inclinations, but seeing that connection was difficult given Bill's time and place in American culture. Perception about the fellowship's association with the Oxford group also came from the outside. In October 1939, shortly after the big book was published, the AMA published a tepid review that condescendingly described the program's method as one of intriguing the alcoholic into acceptance of divine guidance in place of alcohol. Well, that's enough to drive a lot of newcomers away. While the AMA acknowledged the book's recognition of the seriousness of addiction to alcohol, it compared the program to the Dale Carnegie and the Oxford movements, thus having no scientific merit or interest. Well, that was not going to help with the medical profession's perception, was it? To make matters worse, the Akron-Oxford group and its alcoholics continued to be rankled with Bill, albeit for conflicting reasons. There was the impression that the big book was commercial for one thing, And well, besides that, there was no mention of the Oxford group in the first edition of the Big Book. And oh my goodness, the 12 steps had replaced the four absolutes, which were not mentioned either. Oh, wait a minute. It was bad that it was a commercial venture, but they didn't get credit for it. I'm sure Bill scratched his head over that one a little bit. Moreover, in Akron, the very people who put Bill and Bob on their fellowship feet were at odds with each other. Dr. Bob was in the middle of a rapidly developing maelstrom, and the Oxford group members were overbearing enough so that Clarence S. and his hometown alcoholics separated from the Akron group in May 1939, forming in Cleveland the first group named Alcoholics Anonymous. This must have been painful for Dr. Bob, who was trying to keep the peace. However, the fissure was deepening, especially when Anne, Dr. Bob's wife, had words with Henrietta Seiberling. Finally, with mutual hard feelings and sadness, Dr. Bob broke off from the Oxford group in December 1940 and started AA meetings in his own home. While his regrets could not have been too overwhelming, as he referred to the event in a letter to Bill as finally shaking off the shackles of the Oxford group. Now let's flash forward 15 years later. AA was secure enough in its independence from the Oxford group for Bill to acknowledge its early influence. In the foreword to the second edition of the Big Book, he wrote, 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. Okay, that's enough credit, no more. Next, he went straight to clearly separating the AA program from the Oxford group tenets. Bill continued, though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Well, this part seemed more like an attempt to solidify AA's dissimilarities to the Oxford group. Then Bill brought in reinforcements in the second edition. He provided his usual not a religious organization disclaimer in the foreword to the second edition and added Appendix 5, the religious view of AA. In that were endorsements from a Jesuit priest, Father Ed Dowling, a testimonial in the Episcopal magazine, The Living Church, and a statement by Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, an American pastor and central figure in the fundamentalist modernist controversy within American Protestantism. Let me say that again. Protestantism. Thank you. By the way, this is a wonderful context for reading God the Bestseller by Stephen Prothero. It explains how the Big Book came to being during a sublimely perfect time in the history of religion in America. Unfortunately, my neighborhood book club was not interested. Religious affiliation was indeed a tough nut to crack, and difficulty was understandable if not predictable. AA's entanglement with religion might have lessened over time if it had only overcome its history with the Oxford group. Given Bill's frequent Christian references in the Big Book and in 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, it's not surprising that AA's association with religion persists today. AA's literature and its own members will always provide enough doubt that regular disclaimers, such as the one issued recently by the General Service Office, will need to remind the media and the general public that AA is not a religious organization. But as a result of all this, it does not take long to find current articles online that continue to declare AA's religiosity. It's useful for groups to scan these critiques for the purposes of a group self-examination of its own conduct and impact on newcomers. As Bill noted, AA has a long history of writing out disruptions with minimal harm, and such critiques can be helpful to improving the program. So, religion in AA was probably an unavoidable difficulty. The next tough nut was a self-inflicted difficulty: affiliation of a related facility in the form of alcohol education. In a Sixth Tradition essay, Bill illustrated the principle of no endorsement using a member's job opportunity that required affiliating AA with a liquor company. However, a more difficult and complex entanglement occurred between Bill, Dr. Bob, and Marty M. The perilous combination of Marty's ingenuity and Bill's unreserved support for her ambitions to educate the public about alcoholism propelled the two go-getters forward toward unexpected upheavals on several fronts for AA. We already talked about Marty M's story in the big book, Women Suffer Too, in Tradition 5. Well, suffice it to say, Marty qualified for the program. With Bill and Lois's guidance and support, she developed a particular passion for Alcoholics Anonymous. 4 years sober, Marty attended the Yale School of Alcohol Studies in 1943. Her goal was to redirect public attitudes toward alcoholism and recovery. She particularly wanted to help women alcoholics who she felt suffered a double stigma. Marty's charisma positioned her as a leader in the field of alcohol education. Marty created the National Committee on Education on Alcoholism Incorporated in October of 1944 with Yale's financial support and Bill and Dr. Bob's enthusiastic moral support. But mistakes were made, and all with perfectly good intentions. The AA co-founders allowed their names to be included on the NCEA letterhead because it seemed like it was for the good. What harm could there be? At the time, it was a perfectly reasonable request and a helpful thing to do for Marty's organization, which was an AA-related enterprise. Then, Marty started breaking her anonymity at NCEA events, gratefully attributing her sobriety to Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, Marty was merely following a well-known baseball player's lead. His anonymity break seemed to be helping AA, which established a climate of positivity for high-profile anonymity breaks. Bill and Yale enthusiastically supported Marty's anonymity breaks. But then came the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. An NCEA letter went out to the public soliciting funds for the NCEA organization, with the co-founders' names on the letterhead. The letter gave every appearance of a public solicitation for money, not just for NCEA, which was perfectly fine, but also for AA, which was definitely not okay. The letter found its way to a few AA groups, which prompted Dick S., a trustee on the Alcoholic Foundation, to warn Bill, if this letter should ever go out to the AA mailing list, quoting AA throughout and soliciting funds on a letterhead that carries both your name and Dr. Bob's as sponsors, no little hell would be popping. So lessons were learned. Bill said, as groups, we cannot finance or form an alliance with any cause, no matter how good. We cannot link the AA name to other enterprises in the alcohol field to the extent that the public gets the impression we have abandoned our sole aim. To act otherwise will certainly imperil our unity, and to maintain unity is surely our greatest obligation. Ironically, Marty's NCEA and Yale eventually diverged on philosophical and practical grounds. Yale decided to no longer sponsor Marty's organization. Marty changed NCEA to the National Committee on Alcoholism in 1949 and renamed it again in 1957 to the National Council on Alcoholism. She struggled for several years to keep the newly independent organization financially viable without Yale's help, and after some time it did finally prevail. So goes the hazards of outside affiliations. Visibility and profile weighed heavily on Marty and on Bill on a continuing basis, which points somewhat to why Bill did not include this event in his traditions essay. As we sometimes say, too soon? The NCEA debacle was a trifecta of missteps that would inform at least 3 AA traditions that caution against outside affiliation, anonymity, and financial complications. Breaking affiliation with NCEA did not come easily for Bill given his close relationship with Marty. Compromising AA's principles for the greater good would affect his decisions on the fellowship in the future. And compromising AA's principles for the greater good is a phrase that unfortunately rolls off the tongue all too easily for many members, including Bill. But at the end of the day, Bill finally came to believe that AA's principles could never be compromised for the greater good. His own unavoidable visibility and profile in AA would weigh heavily when he abided by principles that could result in the deaths of struggling alcoholics. This dilemma would have its most painful impact on Bill when he practiced the principle of anonymity, which we will talk about in a later presentation. Acknowledging early contributions and avoiding affiliation was another sticking point for Bill. Bill wanted to acknowledge early contributions and avoid affiliation, and over the years he did use the story of the $5,000 Rockefeller donation as a high-impact metaphor for corporate poverty. It was a great story with lots of pauses for humor, and it did deliver an important point about corporate poverty. Unfortunately, this may have been at the expense of other donors. For example, how could Bill overlook Charlie Towns of Towns Hospital? Bill dried out 3 times at Towns, and he had his spiritual transformation there, and it was there that he wandered around looking for drunks to help. However, as William Shaberg pointed out, the possible sticking point was that mentioning that money was also contributed by Charles Towns would mean having to also explain in some detail who he was and why someone running a drying out hospital was giving money to AA, and even more problematic, why AA was accepting money from him. Charlie Towns probably knew his hospital was going to benefit from what Bill and Dr. Bob had created, whether Bill worked for him or not. Nonetheless, Bill's rejection of the lay therapist job was deeply disappointing to Charlie, and yet he faithfully continued his support for the fellowship. When the lion's share of the Rockefeller donation was allocated to Dr. Bob with Bill and Hank's full support, Towns generously provided $500 in monthly installments to help Bill and Hank muddle through financially. And Towns continued to give more later on as the book was reaching the finishing line. As William Shaberg said, Towns was not a rich man. Not rich like the Rockefellers. He was certainly comfortable, but his help was there when Bill really needed it. Now, Towns was not concerned with taking attribution. When talking about the essential help he gave at this decisive point in the story, Charles Towns claimed that he had never sought any credit nor publicity in this matter, and he said, "I don't care for any." But nevertheless, as Shaberg justly observed, But it is a sad fact that this man, one of the great unsung heroes in the story of the writing of the Big Book, continues to receive so little credit for his critical role in making it possible for the book to be written. And there were others who helped this ragtag crew get the book across the finish line. You can learn more from William Schaberg's Writing the Big Book, The Creation of AA. Professionalism in alcohol-related fields in Bill's essay had to do with the liquor trade story, raised the issue of affiliation and breaking anonymity in association with the business. Even with protestations from AA members, Bill wanted to make it clear that it was logical for AA members to pursue professions related to alcoholism. He said, "Therefore, it seems to me that some of us must heed the call from other fields." He cautions those who pursue such fields that serve a dual role of justifying their pursuit of related careers. He said, "And those who do need only remember first and last they are AAs, that in their new activities they are individuals only." To be explicit in what this meant, Bill added, "This means that they will respect the principle of anonymity in the press, that if they do appear before the general public, they will not describe themselves as A's, and possibly hearkening back to his lessons learned in the NCEA fiasco, he said that they will refrain from emphasizing their AA status in appeals for money or publicity." Well, now, notice that Bill spent a lot of time in the original point talking about clubs. So let's take a look at clubs as a related facility. Bill's pamphlet, The AA Tradition, provides guidance underscored by the fumbling experiences of the very first club on West 24th Street in New York City. Written in 1947, Bill first referred to the problems with leadership when he said a corporation was formed to take over the clubroom lease. So then we had to have officials. Should these be directors, run the club, or would it be the AA rotating committee? There were already a lot of questions being raised. Bill continued humorously conveying the importance of this tradition through his own missteps. He said, "Our first club was known, of course, as an AA clubhouse. The corporation holding its lease was titled Alcoholics Anonymous of New York Incorporated. Only later did we realize we had incorporated the whole of New York State, a mistake recently rectified. Of course, our incorporation should have covered 24th Street only." Confusion about Alcoholics Anonymous and clubhouses persists today. With clubhouses springing up rapidly in the 40s, Bill had gathered enough information to write a fairly detailed The 6-Point to Assure Our Future, but that was not enough. He reinforced his point with his pamphlet, The AA Tradition, and how it developed. So the slide will show the original point, and then correspondingly from the pamphlet, Bill says, acceptance of large sums of money from any source to buy, build, or finance clubs almost invariably leads to later headaches. Public solicitation is, of course, extremely dangerous. Complete self-support of clubs and everything else connected with AA is becoming our universal practice. Comparing the original point again with another portion of his pamphlet, Bill says, "This tangle slowly commenced to unravel as we began to get the idea that clubs ought to be strictly the business of those individuals who specially want clubs and who are willing to pay for them. We began to see that club management is a large business proposition which ought to be separately incorporated under another name." And then he goes on with the original point, saying that the directors of a club corporation ought to look after club business only. that an AA group as such should never get into active management of a business project. Hectic experience has since taught us that if an AA rotating committee tries to boss the club or corporation, or if the corporation tries to run AA affairs of those groups who may meet at the club, there is difficulty at once. And then going on with the original point in the pamphlet, he clarifies the only way we have found to cure this is to separate the material from the spiritual. If an AA group wishes to use a given club, let them pay rent or split the meeting take with the club management. In the early fellowship, clubs served as a hub for centralizing AA activities in a geographical area. As the demand for a central meeting of area groups grew, clubs found that they could not sustain such an endeavor. Thus began the central or intergroup services in larger areas. Bill said that every area sooner or later realizes that such concerns as intergroup meetings, hospital arrangements, local public relations, a central office for interviews and information are things for which every AA is interested, whether he has any use for clubs or not. These being strictly AA matters, a central or intergroup committee has to be elected and financed to look after them. Well, the issue of clubs is still very complex, and it requires vigilance in maintaining separation. Bill said well-run clubs continue to make recovery possible for many 12-step programs. Groups can consult the General Service Office guidelines as well on the relationship between AA and clubs. AA does learn to mind its own business. The principle of attraction rather than promotion bears fruit when it is applied to Tradition 6. Without affiliating AA with outside entities such as medicine, religion, and research, those very same entities on their own have incorporated ideas from AA. Other recovery groups modified the program to suit their concerns, and from that grew 12-step programs for a wide variety of addictions. Bill claimed that AA had even influenced politics and business. In short, he said, today we understand and accept this paradox. The more AA sticks to its primary purpose, the greater will be its helpful influence everywhere. The more complex issues in Tradition 6 are problems of money, power, and prestige, which can surface in a multitude of ways. The old adage that love of money is the root of all evil certainly contributes to another tradition solely focused on this topic. We'll learn that AA owes a great debt to Hank Parkhurst, who articulated the need for oversight and accountability when it came to our finances. Hank acted on his own certainty that money would raise suspicions and mistrust within and outside the fellowship. Within a few years, that is exactly what would happen. So for the next presentation, we'll have Tradition 7. Comments and questions, or if you want to be included on a mailing list, please contact me at whatslenderthreads@gmail.com. For other resources and workshop flyers, see www.onwhatslenderthreads.com. And thank you.